So out of the four tissue types in this lecture, we have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Connective tissue is going to be the most abundant. It's found pretty much everywhere in the human body. And there are many different varieties of connective tissue. Some of those varieties are highlighted here on the slide. I want to go over a couple of them. So we can find all the tissue types in this beautiful elbow joint example. So here, I'll start here, we see it's touching the skin. And loose connective tissue. Loose connective tissue is found under the skin. It's going to help give it some protection before we hit other structures as we go deeper into the human body. It's going to give it some flexibility as well. Because remember, epithelial tissue is quite organized, so it doesn't have that flexibility that the dermis, as you'll see, or loose connective tissue has. I want to highlight that here I see a circle, a dark circle, purple stain. Here I see another dark circle. Those are the nucleus of connective tissue cells. You're going to learn that the majority of these cells are fibroblasts. And I can actually see that if I look at all the dark dots here, there are not a lot of cells in loose connective tissue. So that kind of defines what connective tissue is, and I'll go over that in a bit. But those are cells, and I can see that there's not really an organization to those cells. They're just kind of placed randomly. That's what is going to give loose connective tissue its name. In addition, you might see this in texts as areolar connective tissue. It means the same thing. In addition, I want to point out these lines that you see here, these purple hazy lines. Some of them are pink. Those are different fiber types. Depending on the connective tissue, you'll have different fiber types. Here I'm highlighting collagen fiber. Collagen fiber is much thicker fiber type compared to the one I was pointing out before, which is an elastic fiber type. So they're going to provide different effects. Maybe it's resisting tension like collagen does. Maybe it's stretching and recoiling like elastic fibers will do. And usually in connective tissue, we'll find multiple types. That's loose connective tissue. Next, I see over here, it's zooming in on this portion of the human body where it looks like it connects a muscle to a bone. That's called a tendon, as you guys will learn. In a tendon, we actually see something called fibrous connective tissue. I'm going to teach this to you as dense connective tissue. It means the same thing. It's called fibrous connective tissue for the reason that they have tightly packed collagen fibers. This is going to add a lot of strength to this tissue type. In fact, it's the strongest connective tissue that we're going to find. If I compare this tissue type to the loose connective tissue that we just talked about, I can see a difference in the organization of the cells. Here's a cell, there's a darkly stained nucleus, here's another cell, here's another cell. There's actually an organization to them. I can see some parallel fibers running. So there's not a random structure to fibrous connective tissue. There's an organization, and the cells are a little bit more, and the fibers are a little bit more tightly packed than they would be in loose connective tissue. Over here, I can see this yellow area that's just underneath the skin, and it's surrounding multiple tissue types. In this elbow joint example, this is actually fat tissue. This is also known as adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is composed of cells called adipocytes that are going to contain fat energy storage. I can actually see the cells here. They look like just open space. Here's a cell, here's a fat cell, there's a fat cell, and it just looks like white space. That white space is a lipid droplet, multiple lipid droplets that are being stored in the cell. There's actually a nucleus and other organelles, but I can actually see a nucleus. If you look at these cell types, they're at the very tip, there's these darkly stained little dots that are kind of peeking off to the side in all these cell types. That's the nucleus that's being pushed to the edge of the cell because of all that fat that's being stored in adipose tissue. It's a beautiful cushion and insulation type connective tissue. Cartilage comes next. If I look at the end of the bone here I'm at the end of the humerus, I actually have cartilage connective tissue. Cartilage connective tissue will be highlighted a bit more in the skeletal system chapter. In cartilage connective tissue, I actually have a bunch of collagen fibers that run all around that tissue type. But it's different from fibrous connective tissue in that it has a lot of water that's composing that tissue type. This makes it a beautiful cushion, and in fact, cartilage is a precursor to the next tissue type I'm going to talk about, bone. In addition, cartilage also forms a nice shape to it. We see cartilage structures at the tip of our nose and in our ears. We see those, that connective tissue type. I'll talk more about cartilage in the skeletal system chapter. Bone comes up next. Lots of students don't think that bone tissue is alive. Bone tissue is very much alive and very similar to cartilage, but it is different in that it's consisting of a hard mineral deposit matrix composed of calcium and phosphate. So we'll learn more about that later. That is a connective tissue type as well. The last connective tissue type that I want to discuss is blood. Here I see a blood vessel running just underneath the radius there, between the radius and the ulna. It's actually embedded in the adipose tissue, it looks like. Well, that's blood. Blood is a fluid connective tissue type that's going to be responsible for transporting oxygen, in addition to many other things throughout our body. So I just named a bunch of different connective tissue types. How are we categorizing these guys as connective tissue? They seem quite different. Well, if we think back at epithelial tissue, those cells were actually very tightly packed. They had no space between their neighbors. In fact, they liked to form junctions, special junctions between their neighbors to even be more tightly adhered together. Connective tissue is going to be very different in that we have very few cells consisting of this tissue, lots of space between neighbors. So here I see multiple cells. In this embryonic connective tissue example, this type of connective tissue will go and form all the other types of connective tissue that I just discussed. And the cells, as you notice, there's lots of space between them. That's going to be a feature of connective tissue. They rarely make contact with each other. They don't form junctions. Really, what I want to point out, the beautiful part of connective tissue is that it is composed of a non-living extracellular matrix. What I mean by that is extra, outside, cellular, the cell, is what's found outside of the cell. Really, everything that you see here that's not the cell, everything. That pinkish area, those are fibers. That whitish area, that's going to be water, ions, depends on the connective tissue type. Proteins, this is all extracellular matrix. We can see that there is a lot of extracellular matrix compared to cells if we actually form that ratio. The extracellular matrix, again, is not living. It is not composed of cells. The cells themselves in the connective tissue do make extracellular matrix. They secrete water, ions, proteins, fiber types into the ECM. The fact that the extracellular matrix consists the majority of this tissue type really does make it a connective tissue feature.